Welcome to the New School. My name is Leslie Painter-Farrell. I am the director of the MATESOL program, and it's my great honor to welcome you today to this presentation. I have to say that I have tried for many years to get this presenter, and thanks to Leo, we've managed to do it tonight. Before I begin, I just have to say a few thank yous, because as you can imagine, it takes quite a few people to get an event like this together. So first of all, Sherry Allen, National Geographic, they're sponsoring tonight, so thank you very much. Also, thank you to the publishers. We've got Pearson, Oxford, and Cambridge downstairs, so please go downstairs and have a look at their tables and the new titles that they've got to offer, as well as a table which has our outreach program and details about that. Thank you, first of all, to everybody who donated to the outreach. You know that was an option. We hope you continue to donate to our outreach. Our coordinator, Roshi Jolly, will be downstairs to explain further about what we do. And I know there are many volunteers who teach in the outreach here tonight, so thank you very much, because I know you do so much for us. Thank you to Really Useful Media. They're here and they're filming tonight. And then also thank you to just our indispensable team. At this time it has been Charlotte Turnbull, who's over there, Charity Vince, who's over here, and then Chelsea Parrish. Quite literally, we couldn't do anything like this without them. So just some housekeeping. Please turn off your, silence your cell phones, and Q&A will be at the end. Okay, so I want to say thank you to Leo. Leo is full-time faculty in the MATESOL, and he's going to introduce his tutor.
So thank you, and on behalf of the MATESOL program in the School of Public Engagement at the New School, it gives me great pleasure to be able to welcome you here tonight. To anyone working in or familiar with the field of second language development tonight, our guest truly needs no introduction. However, I hope you will indulge me, if only to heighten the anticipation of what I anticipate will be a very enlightening talk. Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman is a prolific writer and has written dozens of articles and textbooks. ESL teachers will likely know her from her many reference texts, as well as her work on grammar dimensions. Applied linguists will know her for much of her work, including her pioneering work on complex dynamic systems theory applied to second language learning. She is also a professor emerita at both the University of Michigan and the SIT Graduate Institute, as well as a visiting senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. She continues to lecture around the world, and while we were arranging and organizing for this event tonight, every time that she responded, it seemed as if she were in a different country. Despite all of this, she claims to be semi-retired. Just reading about her enormous contributions to the field made me exhausted. To my mind, what makes her truly unique and truly inspirational in our field is that her work encompasses the breadth and the depth of second language development. She is well known to English language teachers because she has written and spoken about so many effective and practical approaches that can be applied in the classroom to help our learners to improve their day-to-day communication skills and improve their language generally. I suspect many here tonight know that her work shows an acute awareness of the needs of our learners. However, Diane Larsen-Freeman is not only, or even primarily, an author whose works help practical in-class application. She is also a first-rate scholar who has conducted important research in understanding the process of second language development and in exploring theories that can help link our understanding of the ideas with the practice of actually using and learning language that so many teachers want and need. There are far too few scholars, and none, I believe, of Diane's stature, who play the critical yet poorly supported role of linking our understanding of the deep and incredibly complex intellectual processes of language development with the actual nitty-gritty, day-to-day, but also deep and incredibly complex challenges that every teacher faces when helping our students to learn a new language. With Diane's keen insights, the intellectual process of exploring second language development need not be esoteric ivory tower ruminations, but can move much closer to helping language teachers apply a solid understanding of language in a way that makes sense in the moment of human-to-human interaction that is the classroom. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman.
I know, and you know, that no teacher should take credit for the success of his or her students. But Leo was a student of mine just a few summers ago now, just for a short course at a summer institute. And I can't help but feel some satisfaction at his success. So thank you very much for that, even though I know it's not me that has made him so successful. Thank you also to Leslie. Where are you? I saw you just come in. Leslie Painter-Farrell, for your leadership and for supporting my coming here. And Charlotte Trumbull over there, whose birthday it is today, has been somebody with whom I've had a lot of contact. Even something as simple as just having a speaker come, there's a lot of back and forthing that it takes. Thank you to you for coming and giving me a reason to be here, a reason to return home, because I'm a New Yorker. And many of you know that. Those of you who know me know that. I don't hide it. Even though, I don't know, maybe you don't accept that I'm a New Yorker. I was born in Brooklyn, not Manhattan. And then in a very common story, as my father went up the ladder, he was a banker, we moved to Queens. And then where? Nassau County. We never made it to Suffolk. We went as far as Nassau. But yes, I certainly identify with being in New York. It's wonderful to be here. I don't remember there being so many people, though, when I was growing up. My goodness, the city is teeming with life. And then, on kind of a gap year, when I came back from teaching in the Peace Corps, I lived in Greenwich Village on Jane Street. So this really is coming home for me. So thank you for coming. It's nice to be here. So I'm going to talk about empowerment, mutual empowerment, and the idea of agency. And the reason I've chosen this topic, and I've written about it just recently, I mean, I've submitted the manuscript. I suppose it'll be reviewed and hopefully published. And I've spoken about it a little bit in different parts, but the reason of the world, but the reason I'm interested in it is I started noticing the word agency coming up a lot. Agency, agency, agency. And I thought to myself, why is it that that term is so prevalent in the professional discourse, but also in the world around us? And then, it didn't take too much to connect the dots and see that the reason agency, the capacity to act in the world, is so common these days is because a lot of people, like me, feel disempowered, feel that we don't have not control, but even influence on very vital issues that are affecting our lives. And I'm not going to make a political statement. That's not my purpose here. I think people across the spectrum feel disempowered in many ways, in this country and abroad. I think about the refugees around the world who are fleeing violence and war, economic deprivation, environmental degradation, only to be met often in an unwelcoming way, not allowed to cross the border to what they seek as refuge. I just think we live, as Henry Thoreau said. Henry Thoreau is a social critic or a cultural critic. You may know the name. He's sort of a public intellectual, and he's been largely influential in critical pedagogy of the Freudian sort. So he was here in April for the American Educational Research Association, and he made some comments on the anniversary of the publication of Paulo Freire's very important work. And he said, Henry said, "These days are dark." And I don't want to, this is a terrible way to start a talk, is to depress you all. I don't mean to depress you all, but I think you feel it. Do you not feel it? The heaviness of so many issues that we're dealing with, and the divisions that we have in our country, and the hatred that we see evidence, again, all the way around. This is troubling. This is much more than I've ever experienced in my life. So the days are dark, but there are ways that we can deal with it. And one response is activism, right? For some, the response to feeling disempowered is activism, marching, demonstrating, writing letters, and op-ed columns, organizing. But teachers can be activists as well in their own classrooms. And in fact, probably that's where we'll have more influence. We should be doing all of it, I suppose, but that's maybe we'll have more influence at a local level. However, it's been observed that well-intentioned teachers can teach in a culturally sensitive manner and still enable racism. How can implicit bias be eliminated? Deborah Lowenberg-Ball asked in this city last April. Deborah Lowenberg-Ball was my dean at the University of Michigan, the School of Education, and she just stepped down, the president of the American Educational Research Association. And she asked, how can implicit bias be eliminated? And she offered one thing that might help, and that's what she called discretionary moments. Now, what she meant by that, let me just read it. Teaching is dense with discretionary moments. We usually draw on our experience. However, we have the power of teaching to disrupt racism and promote justice by developing a repertoire of practices in ways that counter normalized practice. So what she means is that every lesson, every hour we're in the classroom, we are faced with moments where we make decisions that we have discretion about. And if you just step back in a moment and think, there are probably dozens of them in every lesson, just simple decisions we have to make. Like, should I call on student X or Y? How much wait time should I give? Should I call it all? Should I answer it myself? Is it time to move the lesson forward or to go back? How about if I didn't get all the students? How about if I know certain students haven't really learned what I'd hoped they learned today? What do I do about that? But the micro-moment decisions all the time that teachers make, that make teaching a very complex act. We have in our power an opportunity to step back and say, is this promoting justice? Is this an example of implicit bias? And perhaps making a decision different from what we might do if we had not asked that question. And Deborah Ball, she had a wonderful video, which I don't have. I'd show it to you if I did, where a group of fifth grade students were being taught math. And it was a multi-ethnic group, multiracial group in the classroom. And the teacher, who was Deborah Ball, showed how, by working with the students that were present, everybody that she worked with in this video felt included, felt valued. There wasn't, and they were at different levels of understanding about the mathematical problem she posed, but she didn't give up. She stayed with them. She made decisions on a moment-by-moment basis that supported those students and their learning, or at least that's what it appeared to be. So we have an opportunity, perhaps, to develop a repertoire of practices that counter normalized practice just by stopping and saying, are we promoting justice? Are we disrupting racism? Try it. Another response to challenging times is this concern with agency. Now, I'm not talking about learner autonomy. That's a very well-established sub-discipline in the field. It's got a distinguished history, and among other things, it discusses the promotion of self-access centers, learning strategies. There was a recent issue of the IATEFL Special Interest Group newsletter called Independence that talks about learner autonomy, and that's important. That's important. But I'm talking about something much bigger or wider. That is, as I said earlier, the capacity to act in the world. Evan Thompson is a philosopher. He was at the University of Toronto. He's now at the University of British Columbia. And I read him, and every time I see his name, he's got a lot of powerful things to say. But the capacity to act in the world, again, I think many of us, I'll speak for myself, I feel disempowered. I don't always feel, and I never have in the past, feel so disempowered as I do today. So how can we promote, how can we encourage, enhance the capacity to act in the world? Now, Hearn, who's a anthropologist, actually, has observed that social movements have encouraged scholarship on agency. And so it's not surprising then that I would hear the word agency a lot, because it is a very timely topic. It's no coincidence that people are talking about agency, and this is happening in our field too, in the form of monographs, anthologies, numerous articles, and I go to conferences and I hear about agency all the time. So I think, again, perhaps you haven't heard that, but I think you'll hear more and more about it, and perhaps some of you have already become in contact with it. Now, as I say, this is maybe a new phenomenon, maybe not. I'm more aware of it anyway. But I've been aware for much longer than recent times of the fact that we've often treated, at least in our theories, maybe not in our classroom so much, but at least in our theories, we treat learners as being non-agentive. We do it implicitly, not explicitly, but we do it, and I'm going to say we do it in 7 ways, or there's 7 theories that I think suggest learners are not agentive. I'll take you through one by one, and then I'm going to use a good portion of my remaining time to push back against those 7. And then I'll conclude at the end by suggesting ways that we can mutually empower our students and ourselves. So here are the 7. And by the way, I've contributed to some of these implicit portrayals. So let's have truth in advertising here, because you can only act from your own awareness, can't you? And as I tell my own students, it's important to understand ideas at the time that they were born, right? It's easy to look back and say, oh my goodness, what were they thinking? But let's try to understand them when they were born. So the first one, simply a developmental view. And this was an idea that was very prevalent when I came into the field many years ago. I'm not going to tell you. A lot of years ago. I've been teaching for 50, so that should tell you something. But anyway, I had been teaching in the Peace Corps. I mentioned that earlier. I came in from Borneo, from Sabah, not very happy with what I had been doing. I mean, I had a great Peace Corps experience. I made friends. I think I had a good relationship with my students and my colleagues. But I didn't feel very satisfied as a teacher. And then I went to grad school to look for some answers. And of course, you don't get answers in grad school. You just get more questions, right? And then they charge you for those. But that's all right. That's another story. The point is that at the time I went to grad school, this is in the early 70s. I did just tell you, didn't I? Early 70s. The big rage was the cognitive revolution. Noam Chomsky was on the scene, and he certainly influenced linguistics, first language with lots of things, first language acquisition psychology, second language acquisition and learning. And the claim was that there were universals in language, universals that led to universal acquisition orders. And Pitt Corder, in a famous article, described or suggested that there existed a built-in syllabus, something inside our heads that would guide our learning, a built-in syllabus, and developmental sequences that everybody would follow. I should do it this way for you, in a linear fashion. I went, oh my goodness, if there's a built-in syllabus and I could get my hands on that, just think how much more effective I would be as a teacher, because I'd be able to teach in harmony with the natural proclivities of my students, not contrary to them in the way that I had experienced or felt I was experiencing. Now, alas, a short story is that there isn't one, but at the time, notice that it's non-agentive, right? Because the idea was just present some language, the universal syllabus will take over, and there's no agentive move necessary on the part of learners. Do you see why I call it de-agentifying? Well, how about pedagogical then? There's certainly been claims that you can design a task, it can have certain characteristics or features. It's called task as planned. So you can create a task, you can plan for a task, and you should. Teachers should. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't. But we can't make the mistake of assuming that what we plan is necessarily going to be equated with learner performance on the task when enacted. And yet people still talk about building in certain features of the task as if it's going to yield, the task is going to yield certain features of learner learning performance. And one of the other chestnuts that I always talk about is the claim that learners need comprehensible input to be provided for them. Now, no one suggests you teach with incomprehensible input, right? I mean, let's face it, teachers, students, everybody needs to understand the language that they're being asked to learn. But it's always, at least initially, it was very much a question of providing comprehensible input. Teachers should be doing that. Notice that's a very passive role for students, right? Nothing about the students themselves deciding what's comprehensible or making it comprehensible. It was mainly that the teacher should furnish that for them. Again, I think it's a de-agentifying process. So even the social process, even claiming that second language development is a social process, can in fact lead to students being done unto, as in Duff and Doherty's observation that young learners can be passively socialized into the communities in which they live. They'll just be socialized. They will just be socialized. Notice the passive voice. And again, it suggests that they don't have an active role in their own socialization process. Categorical, that individuals are categorizable, while disregarding their intra-category differences. And when we do that, we change how we interact with them and how they think of themselves. So we put them in categories, and again, categories themselves are not bad. Learners with learning differences, that's not a bad category. It's good to know if students struggle in their learning. The problem is when we put everybody together in that category, what happens? We ignore the individual differences within the category. And as I say, that actually affects how we interact with them and how they think about themselves. They now have a label. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we shouldn't categorize. It's human to categorize. But I think it's not an agentifying thing to do. Statistical. We do research. We do statistics on research. We try to capture what's happening with individuals by simply aggregating data on those individuals. We use Gaussian statistics with a bell-shaped curve. And we see that the largest hump of the curve is the mean, and that's where most learners are. And we make generalizations based on those statistics. And by the way, there is no one student or learner ever represented there. There's no one learner that fits that point. It's an aggregate. And so again, I think that's, by just aggregating data on individuals, we lose that sense of individual agency. Ideological, that language is a closed teleological system which encourages deficit thinking. Teleological just means that it has an end or a purpose. I don't think language has an end. I don't think language learning has an end. I think it goes on and on and on. And therefore, if you think it has an end, you always judge or estimate students, I don't mean you, but one does, and the distance they have to go to get to that end, right? That end being, in the past, isomorphism with native speaker speech. So it encourages deficit thinking to think about language as a closed system. It's not. It's not static. It's always moving. And finally, a critical perspective that the language or dialect of minoritized populations is unacceptable. That's certainly de-agentifying. Now, I could probably write an article or a book about each one of these. I'm not going to do it. I just wanted to give you a flavor of what I meant with my saying I was concerned for a long time about learners not being construed in an active way, responsible for their own learning in any way, or agentive. That I felt, and again, nobody was trying to put learners down. Don't misunderstand me. I was in that group too for some of these. But I think now, looking back on it, I think we've ignored an important point. So, developmental, pedagogical, social, categorical, statistical, ideological, and critical are all areas that I'd like to push back on for the next bit of time. But I'm going to start by making the point that learners are individuals and they can act in an agentive way, contrary to our theories and our practices. And so they often just have one name, and I'll just tell you very briefly about each of these three. Some of you may be acquainted with them. But Dick Schmidt studied somebody called Wes. Now, Wes and Schmidt lived in Hawaii. Wes is a Japanese American, and he's a successful art dealer. He's very social. He has a lot of friends, and he has a successful business. He's been in this country for a number of years, or he was at the time of Schmidt's study. And he spoke English in a way that wouldn't be considered standard or grammatical or accurate or fluent or anything. Now, here's somebody who's had a lot of comprehensible input. You would think would be motivated to learn English. It might help his business, but he never progressed, or not very much. And when Schmidt asked him why, he said, well, I think other people should learn to talk to me. I don't think it's my job to go to them. Interesting, huh? I think that's interesting, but that certainly challenges the idea that all you need is comprehensible input or social proximity to learners. Georgette Ayups and her colleagues had a participant in their study named Julie. Julie was a 21-year-old in England who met an Egyptian man. They got married, they moved to Cairo. She took up residence there. She had raised her family there. As far as I know, she may still live there. Now, she's 21. It is said, the researchers say, that you can't discern an accent. You can't tell that she didn't start learning Egyptian Arabic until she was 21. She was taken in by the family, lots of extended relatives, and she became part of the family. And so this Julie flies in the face of what's been called the critical period, right? That after a certain length of time, you no longer had the wherewithal to be able to master a second or foreign language. She was apparently, except for a few tiny, tiny things, she was apparently indistinguishable from a native speaker of Egyptian Arabic. These are individual cases, but I love the fact that they make us think twice and thrice about our claims about learners' agency. And then there's a more recent study by Søren Eskildsen, where this is a classroom-based study using tapes that were recorded, videos that were recorded at the Portland State University, and is now a corpus. And this is Valerio, a Spanish speaker they're using. Of course, all of these are pseudonyms. Valerio was a Spanish speaker. This was in a community college, and he was quite a low level. The class was false beginners or low intermediate. Now, Valerio took upon the role himself of being the leader, in the sense that when new students came in, and they were all the time because it was a community college and students would show up and come into the class, he took the role of being the guide, helping them learn the ropes of how the teacher wanted them to behave and how to work with them. And so he said a lot of things, but one of the things that was recorded by Eskildsen is he kept saying, "You know, right." The teacher didn't want them to write. She wanted them to listen. So this one excerpt, he's got, "You know, right," U-N-O, "You know, right, you know, right," which, given the sequences of development that we expect in the study in the acquisition of English negation, would be out of order for what he should be doing if we had a developmental sequence that followed what everybody else was reporting. So do you see my point? Here are just 3 individuals, and there are others, but these individuals are showing that they had agency in a way that was not in keeping, was not consistent with our theoretical claims. And that's great, right? We get to learn something from their experience. So while I acknowledge the contextual embeddedness of agency, I also assume that learners can adopt different orientations to it. I think these three are examples of what I mean by different orientations. Okay, now I hope I've made the case that we need to do something. What can we do then? Well, the Douglas Fir group, of which I was a member, wrote, teachers normally have the power to determine the types of activities and resources to which learners will be given access and the opportunities they will have to engage in the activities, and it's usually teachers who do the assessing. And this just is a statement of fact. But learner agency may be more sustained when teachers ask themselves, Bao says, when teachers ask themselves questions such as, who gets to ask questions? Who gets to remain silent? And in which ways do some learners in my class choose to use silence? Now, this is sort of a microcosm of what I was saying earlier, or maybe it's not a microcosm, it's a reflection, it's stepping back, actually, from those, just those moments that I talked about earlier with Deborah Ball, calling them discretionary moments. This is a more reflective practice, looking back and saying, who in my class, how do they choose to use silence, those that do? There was a study done way back in 1982 by Charlene Sato, where she showed that teachers in ESL classrooms tended to call less frequently on Asian American students than they did on Caucasian students. This was in Hawaii, the study. And you could say, well, the teacher knows that the students are uncomfortable when they're called upon, so maybe she was being concerned about their well-being, their emotional state. On the other hand, were they being robbed an opportunity to participate in the class? Why were they silent? Why did they choose to use silence? I think we can ask those kinds of questions. We can think of affordances rather than input. Leo Van Leer's important distinction. Input suggests a one-way action from the environment to the learner, but an affordance is a relationship between an organism and a particular feature of the environment. So a leaf, his example, a leaf on the forest floor offers food for a caterpillar, shade for a spider. What's my point? My point is that any particular object or action or activity or task can offer different learners, afford different learners different opportunities for learning, right? It's not that the task is always going to be enacted in the same way. In fact, it's a relational, a relation between the learner and, we'll say, the feature of the environment, including the teacher and the other students and the time. The affordance construct recognizes that language learning is not an isolated activity within the implicit causality of input and output, but a dynamic process that mandates that learners be active participants in the language learning environment. Now, there are two, I've made a distinction between two orders of affordances, because affordances is a fairly common term used these days. But I think sometimes, because it's polysemous, it has more than one meaning, we get a little confused. So I made a distinction last year between first order and second order. The first order is the teacher or the environment provides affordances. So if you're in a school district that has a bilingual education policy, you're afforded the opportunity to become bilingual. But the second order is very important, and one that I think we often overlook, which is that the learner has to perceive that affordance and act on it. Otherwise, it's not an affordance, right? Just because they're in the school district, just because the policy is bilingual doesn't necessarily mean that learners are going to become bilingual. Obviously, there has to be something within the learner. I'm going to maybe skip the next one, but basically the idea here, and you're welcome to look at the study, it's in the Modern Language Journal. Tom's, or she, I think it's a she, is teaching a course on Hispanic culture in Spanish. It's a content-based course. But the point that was interesting to me in this is that one of the students made a mistake, made a mistake. And the natural tendency is for teachers to recast that, right? To say correctly what it is that the student said incorrectly. But she was a very skilled teacher, and she didn't just do a cognitive recast. She interacted with the student, socially constructing something that benefited everybody. Everybody could benefit from the fact that the student had made that mistake. It wasn't just to the student, and it wasn't just cognitive. There was an interaction. There was a relationship that meant a learning opportunity for others, not just the student who had made the mistake. In other words, agency does not inhere in a person, but rather arises from a relational person-context interface. This is an ecological position, one that I've been committed to for a long time in the form of complexity theory. Leo was talking about this, or complex dynamic systems theory as it's called these days. I know this is annoying when I skip my slides, but I'm also mindful of the time, so I'm going to skip the next one, even though I wrote it. So this is unfortunate, but I liked my term, so I'm not going to saying that a moving tapestry of interacting systems is a better way of thinking of language, I think, and learning and learners. It's an ecological theory. This maybe says it better because it's Rumi, not Larsen-Freeman. And he wrote that 1 + 1 does not equal 2. Sufi poet Rumi. He says, because you understand one, you think because you understand one, that you must therefore understand 2. Because 1 and 1 makes 2. But you forget that you must also understand and. In other words, understanding a complex system, like language, like agency, like classrooms, requires relational thinking, more than understanding each member of the class or each part of the language atomistically, apart, independently, separately. So that brings me to complexity theory. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before. I'll be brief, but I can't not talk about it because I'm passionate about it. Complex systems are made up of many components which interact and give rise to another level of complexity. So I'm maintaining that language is a complex system. I'm maintaining that classrooms can be complex systems. In fact, once I've learned to think this way, I think everything is a complex system. Probably together here we are also a complex system. But the basic idea that usually is used is the bird flock. The birds are interacting on the ground. You walk by. Oh, it didn't happen to me today, though, in New York. You have some bold birds, I must say. Because I was I was on my way here, and I was specifically thinking about bird flocks, and this bird stood its ground, and I was like right next to it, but it had a piece of bread in its mouth, so maybe it didn't want to let it go that, but it stood its ground. Normally, you walk by a bird flock, and what happens? I mean, they do the same thing here, right? They just take off. But notice, they interact, they take off, as one, as a kind of supraorganism. And then they come back down, they maybe separate from some obstacle, some wire or something. They come back and land as one, and then they go about their individual business. Now, if you think about a language learning community or a language speaking community, there's a lot of interaction, each one doing his or her own thing, and out of that arises the dialect or the language or the changes in both, right? Do you get that? I hope it's not too much of a stretch. I am using environmental pictures. I love nature anyway, but I think it's got some lessons to teach us here about the nature of language. It's not a contained system. It changes as a result of the interactions. What we do in the classroom changes behavior and learning as a result of the interactions. An important concept in complexity theory is emergence, the spontaneous occurrence of something new that self-organizes from the interaction. So some new things come out of this interaction. Learning a language is not about conformity to uniformity. New things arise as people interact with the language. I'm talking about speakers, but this is true for learners as well. So emergent patterns. This is, of course, a schooling fish, but schooling a fish school. But it's the same idea as the flocking birds. We shouldn't treat language, Suresh Raja tells us, as a starting point. We should see how diverse verbal resources are taken up by people to establish meaning and negotiate relationships. Thus, instead of assuming that every phenomenon can be explained in terms of simpler components, complexity theory shifts the search to understanding how patterns arise bottom up from components interacting within the ecology in which they operate. Now, this may if you understand this, it may seem very commonsensical to you. But notice that for years and years, the field has been enthralled with the idea that there are rules somehow that operate top-down, right? In a kind of, well, I was going to say exceptionalist, but that's probably not fair. But that basically you have this canon of rules that operates on the language. This is saying, no, actually it's not a top-down process, it's a bottom-up process. Out of the interaction, the quote I like so much from James Blake's book is, the act of playing the game has a way of changing the rules. And he's not talking about language rules, but more wider concepts. But the act of playing the game, the act of using language, has a way of changing it. Of course, these patterns arise, and then they are subsequently, through a process we've taught, Lynn, Karen, and I have called reciprocal causality. So there's they rise, and then there's global to local processes of constraint. So there's a cyclical process. It can't just always arise. We would have mutually unintelligible dialects, right, or individuals. There has to be something that works down. One more picture from nature, and I'm fond of this one too, because I think it tells us a lot. You see the eddy or the whirl in the stream? Complexity theory talks about how patterns in the flux are created. I love that, creating patterns in the flux. So if you think about the eddy in the stream, that whirl, how is it created? Well, it's created by the flow of water, by the bend in the stream, by the contour of the stream bed, by the banks, right? So the spatial environment is very important for creating this pattern. But notice it's also time-bound, too. There's a temporal context, because the reason you have this eddy is because it snowed last winter in the mountains. And with the spring melt, you get the flow that allows for this eddy to arise, this spontaneous pattern in the flux. Notice also that the water passing through the whirl, the water molecules or droplets, are not the same. It's the pattern that endures. Can you make any kind of connection with language? I mean, I'm speaking English. I mean, I guess you know that. But it's not the English of Shakespeare, and we call it English. It's changing all the time, and yet the patterns endure. They change over time, of course, but the patterns endure, even though they're even though the language is flowing through them. And they're context-bound, temporally, and spatially. So Sarah Mercer says, viewing agency holistically also implies considering it as temporally situated, connecting together the dynamics of a person's ongoing life history, including their past and present experiences, as well as their future goals, expectations, and imaginations. And some of you may have seen this before. It's from my own work, published in 2006, where we reviewed and studied the language development of a group of Chinese women over a course of time, from June to November. They came to me. I was directing the English Language Institute at the University of Michigan. They had accompanied their spouses, who were graduate students at the university, and they said, you know, we're professional women. We would like to do something with our time, not just bide our time while we're here. Would you please create a course for us to improve our work on our English? And I said, sure, just if you'll let us study your language development. That was my request in turn, and they agreed. Now, if you look at these, I know you can't see it very well, but there are 4 measures: accuracy, fluency, vocabulary complexity, and grammatical complexity. And if you look at those lines, they're the averages. What do you see? Would you be happy if you were their teacher? They had the same teacher, same materials. Would you be happy? Yeah, you'd be happy, right? I mean, they all improved. They were all better off at the end, or the line shows that the average is. There was a dip in August, but we all dip in August, don't we? So that's not so unusual. We know learning is nonlinear. But notice, this is the average. You remember what I said before about the average doesn't really tell you anything about what the individuals who make up that average. And so when we look one level of granularity lower, we see that these learners are all over the place, right? Can you see that just with the lines? In fact, some are poorer, are less well off at the end than in the beginning on these measures. These are the birds, not the bird flock. And then even within the individual, there's ups and downs. We know this. The one thing that's known for certain is that the average is not good enough if the goal is to understand individuals. You must explain patterns of individual variability. And behavior is not something that a person has. It emerges from the interactions between the individual and his or her context. So if we ignore variability, then individuals become synonymous with statistical averages. Instead, individual variability is the essence of adaptive behavior. Amy Gutman is the president of the University of Pennsylvania, where I have a visiting appointment these days. And she convened the Sylvan Forum last February, in which she invited several speakers. Most noteworthy were Joe Biden, Jeb Bush was another, and some other luminaries. And they wanted to talk about immigration. What can we do about this broken immigration policy in this country that's terribly discriminatory and leaving the DACA folks out in the cold? And she made an interesting comment. I wrote it down verbatim. At its core, immigration is about the fate of millions of individual people, refugees, migrants, displaced people, DACA recipients, etc. Yes, but individuals with lives and families. And maybe just as one little political comment, we certainly have seen that recently, haven't we, when the families have been separated. And some broadcasters have been following the fate of an individual child. But the point is, it's about individuals, not about the collective category of DACA recipients, for instance, right? By the way, I know if I go too far on the individual end, I sound more like Ayn Rand and the neoliberals. I'm not trying to argue for that. I think we can, though, talk about individuals without individualizing. The nonlinearity and multi-causality of the process argues also against pedagogical treatments, inevitably leading to particular learning outcomes. I coined the term reflex fallacy a long time ago. No one else has picked it up, so I keep talking about it. Maybe one of you will help me out. The reflex fallacy is the idea that we should do in the classroom what is done outside the classroom in terms of learning. I don't mean the language itself. But if, for example, comprehensible input is available outside, that's what we should do inside, right? I call it a reflex fallacy because I don't think our job is to emulate what goes on naturally in terms of techniques. The language is different in terms of techniques. I think our job is to improve, to facilitate the learning of language, not to emulate what learners can get anywhere. So Biesta and Tedder put it this way. They posit agency is not a power that one has, but rather is something one achieves by means of an environment, not simply in an environment. So how can we help our learners achieve it? What kind of environment can we create? And I'll get to that in a few minutes, but let me just say one more thing, which is that Lantoff and Thorne have written, agency also entails the ability to assign relevance and significance to things and events. And so going back to my learners now, what we did is to try to tease out what their developmental trajectories were. We put two of the measures, vocabulary complexity in this case on the x-axis and grammatical complexity on the y-axis, and you see the patterns start to be revealed. That is, for example, the learner L seems to be much more taken with working on her vocabulary, her lexicon, where the other learners, to varying degrees and non-linearly, are working on grammatical complexity. In the next slide, we see grammatical complexity and fluency. And again, we do see patterns, right? But they're not revealed in averages, is what I'm trying to say. Teaching does not cause learning. Learners make their own paths. That doesn't mean there's not a role for the teacher. I'm not, hopefully not leaving you with that impression, but learners have agency, and as I said earlier, learning another language is not about conformity to uniformity. So the learner makes personal sense out of what they encounter and uses affordances in ways that are personally meaningful and relevant. Agency thus emerges from the interaction between resources and context and the learner's perception and use of them. I feel like I'm saying that over and over again. Do you get that point? Good, I won't say it again. Okay, so they use what they have. Even if it's not very much language, they use what they have to make meaning in a personal way, to say what they want to say to the extent that they can. And so what results? Is it an innovation or an error? If a learner says informations, is it an error? What do you think? No one wants to commit. I would have circled this a while ago, but as Jennifer, or actually it's Barbara Sodelhofer points out, this is a form that's common with English as a lingua franca speakers in violation of the non-count nature of the noun in standard English because ELF users exploit the potential of language. English is lingua franca where students who don't have a common L1 are speaking, not students, speakers who don't have a common L1 are using English with each other. So a German and a Japanese business person using English. How about this one? This data, is it an error? So when I grew up, I was told it's what? Who's oldest? You're not as old as I am, but who remembers these days? These data, right? Data is plural, and it's these data. In my dissertation, it was these data. I'm sorry. That's it. But in fact, if you read research reports these days, or even the popular press, they talk about this data. Because, this is Jennifer Jenkins, there are regularization processes afoot. Plural to singular is one of them. So an agenda of phenomena. A lot of people are saying, ooh, but that's what happens, a criteria, this data. Language changes. How about this one? Whoppingly small. Now that, of course, is not a grammatical error, but you might call it a pragmatic error, right? Or a meaningful error. Whoppingly small. This was said by an American academic presenting at a recent symposium, but it's a very odd collocation, because you would normally say whoppingly big or huge, right? Or large. More clear. What do you think? I mean, normally with a monosyllabic adjective, you're going to add what? ER in the comparative. That's the rule, right? But of course, it's changing. It's quite the rule. That rule is pretty straightforward, but the rule for bisyllabic adjectives is much more complex. And in a way to make the language regularized, I think people are now, listen for it. I think you'll hear a lot more plus adjective than you will adjective plus ER, even when it's a monosyllabic adjective of one syllable. Okay, I was in Sri Lanka last September, and I heard this one. Don't horn so loudly. So an example from Sri Lankan English. The point, what's my point? Well, it's an innovation or is it an error? Acceptability is dependent on the interlocutor, the person you're speaking with. And a new form, like this data, may become more acceptable over time. There's no linguistic reason to suggest that one is an innovation and one is an error. There's nothing that distinguishes them linguistically, right? Socially, politically, educationally, yes, but not linguistically. And the innovation extends beyond a single language user. In fact, multilingual, multicultural contexts may favor the creativity. So Walt Wolfram reports on Watchelay. Have you heard this, Watchelay? Anybody? Well, Walt Wolfram is a researcher down in North Carolina. There are a lot of migrant workers there. And he talks about Watchelay, what he says, Watchelay means watch out. It's a combination of English watch and Spanish mirarle. So as I just said, there's no linguistic basis for distinguishing the two. Of course, teachers may have to enforce normative practice. I'm not saying go out and ignore these errors if that's what they are. according to you and according to the standards by which you teach. We have to make sure, as I said, that there's a top-down effect as well, so that these don't, that the innovation has to be constrained in some way. And teachers do need to make learners aware of the consequences of their linguistic choices. One way that I've done this is just to freeze. I'm speaking and I stop and I say, I could say this, or I could say it this way, or I could say it that way. And tell me what you think is the better way to say it, or tell me the difference between those two ways. So it's kind of freezing the action momentarily and involving the learners in figuring that out. Claire Crump has written, we are free to act, but at the same time, we're not in control of the choices that are given to us. We know that. It's not a level playing field. Language, nonetheless, language is not a closed system, and it's important to appreciate that learners have the capacity to create their own patterns with meanings and uses. In truth, learners actively transform their linguistic world. They do not merely transfer previous patterns and conform to it. So we talk about learning transfer. You learn something in the classroom and then you use it outside. That's called transfer, learning transfer or knowledge transfer. I don't think that's true. I don't think that there's a conduit. I believe that we transform and make it fit to a new context. So rather than asking learners what they've been taught, if learners transfer what they've been taught, we should ask them what connections are they making for themselves. Okay, I'm going to get to the part here where I think I could talk about what we can do, but I wanted to do two more caveats. One is Biesta, who observes the question for teachers is not simply what is effective, but rather is what is appropriate for these students under these circumstances. This means, he argues, that inquiry and research can only tell us what is possible, or, to be even more precise, they can only show us what has been possible. They can tell us what worked, but they cannot tell us what works. Now, I'm a researcher, but this is really an important statement, right? Research can tell us what worked in a given study, but they can't necessarily predict what works for this group of students at this time. And then Guadalupe Valdez added that teaching language is never neutral. What you do in the classroom is attached to language policies and ideologies. So I'm going to recommend some practices, but I'm aware of what Guadalupe says, and of course what Biesta has said as well. Yet my title was Mutual Empowerment. So what are practices that potentially benefit both teachers and learners? And so I have, I don't know, about 9 or 10 of them to do in 6 minutes. Are you ready? I might take a few of my Q&A minutes if that's okay. So here's my first one. What can you do to mutually empower, to work together? And one of them is to learn together, So Mike Breen has an article called The Porous Classroom, and Scott Thornbury Elkototova brought it to my attention. The language classroom ceases to be the place where knowledge of language is made available by teacher and materials for learners. It becomes a place from which knowledge of language and its use is sought by teacher and learners together. The classroom walls become its windows. Together, the teacher and the students investigate the language in a process resembling that of linguistic and cultural anthropology. I just like that idea of a porous classroom, right? It's not closed, it's not hermetically sealed from what's going on around it. We have to find ways to let the outside in. So I did this in my class at the University of Pennsylvania last February. I asked them to bring in things they've heard on the radio, or they've read, or they heard in the lunchroom, and we don't have lunchrooms anymore. What do we have? Cafes. So this was something somebody brought in. That morning, he was listening to the radio, and he heard the announcer say, on February 2nd, 2018, the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra is performing Beethoven's infamous Fifth Symphony. And he said, why is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony infamous? And I said, beats me. Let's see what we can find out about why the announcer called it infamous. Interesting. So, does it mean not famous? Hardly. Beethoven's Fifth, you know that one. It goes, how does it go? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Da, 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 da. Right. See? It's not that it's not famous. as in inappropriate. How about does it mean very famous, as in incredible? No, it doesn't mean that either. And so off and running, we were trying to figure out this whole thing. Can't take you through the whole thing, but we did realize, we started brainstorming words that have opposite meanings, but they're two different ones, like unloosen and loosen means the same thing, right? Flammable and inflammable means the same thing. Invaluable and valuable means the same thing. And then we looked at a dictionary and explained that these prefixes can have a variety of meanings, and we discovered we weren't alone. One website reported that approximately 88,000 searched for the word emphas on their site in a recent month. So finally, we concluded that it meant famous in a bad way. And that was not what the author, the announcer, really intended, but listen for it. I think you'll hear infamous being used to mean very famous. And it's not so surprising. There's a website that the University of California developed for the California public schools, where it's called Skills, School Kids in Investigating Language in Life and Society. So they have a chance to look at the pragmatic use of language. Second one, let learners drive their learning. Let them drive their learning. So this is an article published in ELTJ last year, learner-driven feedback. Have you heard of this? Learner-driven, have you? Where learners drive their feedback dialogue for asking for specific feedback. The feedback is given by the teacher, but learners decide how they will receive it. For example, they can choose in-text correction, correction symbols, handwritten feedback, email, audio recording, face-to-face consultation. Well, the teacher probably couldn't manage that in any large classroom, but you might say, okay, every week we'll let one student choose one way of doing this. And so it puts the learners more in the driver's seat. Have students teach each other. I just saw this blog the other day. Reciprocal teaching is a powerful instructional strategy that can help students deepen their learning by teaching other students. Enjoy a gentle, I'm calling it gentler version of translanguaging where the student's home language is allowed to be used, or not allowed to be, it's basically used in the classroom along with English. But Christine Helot talked about creating multilingual spaces to counter the notion that a language or a dialect of minoritized populations is unacceptable. Create a classroom where students are not silenced because they cannot use their own one, where they do not need to find their own strategies to prevent language loss, where their identities and social capital are not invisible, where they are active co-participants in their learning, where their funds of knowledge are respected, and where what is valued at home is also valued at school. Make use of technology. Now, this is, of course, these days, as King observes, the reality is that people of all ages, especially the mobile young, are managing to communicate across cultures and languages because they want to and need to, making use of prior knowledge, language acquired online or the media and electronic translation tools. So there are all kinds of tools available. I heard Rodney Jones last month in Macau. I do travel. I don't know if I was there when you communicated, but he said, students can make recordings of themselves. They can later watch, reflect, transcribe, make vocabulary lists from this recording. I suppose you know all about those kinds of things. At Michigan, we had a professor who had the students compile their own corpora. They chose 20 articles. These were graduate students. They chose 20 articles from their particular discipline, created a corpora from which they could then analyze how academic articles, journal articles are constructed in their discipline. What kind of words are used? How do they begin? How do they end? What are the actual stages or parts of? This is very powerful stuff, right? They're very invested in their own subjects. And so using concordance software and they're free, it's free, can do that. You don't need a lot of language. Georgia O'Keeffe, the American painter, once noted about her paintings, it's equally, if not more soul nourishing to take just one small slice of things and blow it up than to try to describe the whole. Students need to encounter and use the patterns of language iteratively over time. It's navigating the tension between convention and innovation that's central to learning. So have a text, Students read it one day, come back to it again on the other day, have it do a closed passage, later eliminate more words in the closed passage, to later come back and have them do a dictogloss. We're so worried about boring our students, but if you can come up with something a little bit different each time, they may not have been bored. You don't need a big bag of tricks either. Read plus a YouTube video on the same topic. Krashen's talked about narrow reading, reading several texts by one author or about a single topic of interest. Read a simplified account and then a more complex version. Do you know about rewordify.com? This is not a commercial. I have nothing to do with it. But I found out about this. I thought it was interesting. It's a free online reading comprehension software which helps you understand what you read or the text that you couldn't grasp because of the complex vocabulary used in it. So I just did a screenshot. So I took that last, what it just said. Rewordify is a free online reading comprehension software, and I just entered it into the text box, and it translated it for me. It says up at the top, can you read that with the yellow? Rewordify is a free online reading understanding. That was the translation for comprehension. That doesn't work too well, does it? Software, it helps you understand what you read or the text you couldn't grab or couldn't understand. That's a better one, understand for grasp. Do you see the point? It takes the complex and it makes it simpler. Now, I just shown you it's not airtight by any means, but if you could do that over and over again and give students a chance to encounter the same text. Oh, and I couldn't resist. It also has a parts of speech button, so you can click on that and get a color-coded analysis of the sentence in terms of the part of speech. So it might be a useful tool. It's free. I have no commercial interest. I like this idea. This, of course, is very famous, 36 views of Mount Fuji under the wave of Kanagawa. There are 36 of them. I just have 4 there. But it's, again, a metaphor. It strikes me as looking at the same thing from a number of different angles is a very agentifying thing, a very useful way to learn. How about opening yourself? This is a long quote, but I want to just highlight a couple things. I underlined them. Complexity theory's Rika makes the relational aspect of teaching and learning clear and usefully different from the usual. All interactions involve mutual influence. It's been said that teachers must know their students, but usually what is meant is not that the teacher is to be transformed, but that rather that the teacher can, by knowing her or his students, more efficiently, move the student to a desired understanding, right? So know your students so you can help them learn to a better understanding. However, complexity approach suggests not only that attempts such as efficiency are misplaced, but also requires that teachers must be transformed by their students as a result of the mutual influence of teachers and students. I've been saying it's a relation, right? So it can't just be, I'll learn about you to help you. That's not a bad, that's a good intent. But you have to be able to be open to being transformed yourselves. And I think that's mutually agentifying. I'm almost finished. Focus on particularity. Acknowledging our own uniqueness and responsibility brings us beyond the traditional categories that inform analysis of agency. The poor, the wealthy, the educated, the alienated, and so on. Focus on agency as it's experienced by particular people at the moment, in the moment in which self means other. So this is my pushback against the categorization idiom. Accept responsibility. This is from Lynn Cameron's in my book on complex systems. The basic idea is that self-organization, the emergence of order in complex systems are ethically neutral processes. The bird flock, the schooling fish, ethically neutral. It's people who must impose and apply ethics to these processes, recognizing how a decision in one part of a system can affect other parts and ripple outwards to other connected systems. Cultivate awareness. Perhaps the most significant feature of agency in the context of experience is the reflective awareness of our own agency. It is this reflexivity that brings with it a sense of morals in our dialogue with the other. That is, we have some choice in how we author the value of another. As such, we have a sense of making the right choices, of making ethically particular choices that will enrich the other. This points points us towards an aesthetic account of agency that puts potentiality and responsibility at the center of inquiry. Now, I was going to end there, but I have a confession to make. And I was thinking about this. I was involved in something this morning that I should have been present for, but I said, it's New York. I'm only here for 2 days. It's a nice day outside, and I really want to see the Morgan Museum because my husband came with me to AERA in April, and he raved about it. And I didn't go because I'm such a doobie, a good bee. I was at the conference the whole time. So I honestly hate to admit this, but I did. I snuck off, and I went to the Morgan Library. And so my last one is, we need to take care of ourselves. We need to take care of others, but we need to take care of ourselves too. And if that means playing hooky for 2 hours on a beautiful morning in July, then so be it. It also, of course, was very sobering to me because I thought, golly, I'd love to have a library like that, but I guess I'm going to have to work a little longer in order to make that happen. But I think the final one, take care of ourselves, that's really important. We need to take care of each other for sure these days, but we need to take care of ourselves as well. And that's what I tried to do this morning. I always end my talks on complexity theory with one final quote because it's so meaningful to me. Knowing how to negotiate our way through a world that is not fixed, it's not finite, it's not bounded, not fixed and pre-given, but that is continually shaped by the types of actions in which we engage, is a challenge of being human. Thank you for listening. Thank you for that warm response. Now, I did promise that I would leave a little time for Q&A. I cut into some of that time, but we'll just have a few minutes, and then we have some refreshments, I understand, afterwards. So are there questions, or is there a question that anyone would like to ask, and that I'll try my best to answer it?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the talk. I've got a question and some thoughts around that, but I'm wondering what you've experienced in your work with teachers in helping them to engage or go through the process or being open to being transformed in a classroom in which they're supposed to be the authority. I mean, it's hard to do that in any relationship.
So I missed you with your point. In the classroom, that's what?
In which you're supposed to be the authority.
Oh, the authority. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's your job, in a way you're getting, like you said, in terms of, and it's hard to do that in any relationship, to let the other impact and transform you. And I was thinking about what you're talking about, complexity theory and Sugata Mitra's sensibility about self-organizing learning environments and the chaos that's part of that. Mm-hmm. And so I find, because I work with teachers in, that I think they need tools in the classroom to allow, how can you build, how can you create something with students that's not already determined, or you can get lost together. For me, improvisation is helpful with that because it's a way of listening and building. But I was wondering what your experience of that is, helping teachers to grow in that way.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, I have the luxury of getting up here and saying, let's do this. And you're saying, okay, but that's hard. I agree that if you went in there many students from other parts of the world that are going to expect you to be an authority, I don't see why you would want to go in there and suggest otherwise. I mean, I think they're going to count on you for that. And part of their being comfortable is seeing you in that role. I wasn't talking about that so much. I was talking about, as I interact with someone, as I'm doing with you right now, do I allow myself to be open to you and to what you have to say? Or do I say, don't go there, right? Now, part of me wants to say, don't go there, because I don't have a very good answer. But the other part of me says, wow, that's a really interesting thing. I know what I do as a teacher. I don't know if it will be good for you. But I want to be open. I want to think about what you have said. And I want it to affect me in a way where maybe I'll be better prepared the next time. Here's what I do. So at the end of class, when we're finished the lesson, I ask them what they've learned. And not everybody speaks, but it's a good way for me to assess what's gone on, and for them to hear testimonies from the other students as well, and see the diversity there. And then I say what I've learned. I offer that. I don't think that undermines my authority, but it suggests that we are equal in the sense that we're both learners, or we're all learners. So that's one tip, and I don't know, you're nodding, so I hope that's useful to you. But that's what I mean. I don't think you would want to go in there and say, right, let's see what we're going to do. I did say I wrote about, I'm writing about, or wrote this thing that I submitted for publication about agency, and I have a piece on improvisation in it, because I think that is a lot of what we do as teachers. Those are those, micro-moment, discretionary moments where we have to improvise, we have to move. And it's, it's hard with teacher education because we want scripts, we want everything to be controlled. Chaos complexity theory is not about control. Notice there's no captain bird in the flock that says, follow me, right? There's nobody that leads. It's a very democratic thing in the sense that it's emergent out of us, out of our interaction. Thank you. Anyone else? I'll try to be less long-winded with the next one.
Hello. I'm an engineer who uses computational linguistics, and I'm interested in trying to develop tools for both teachers and students that are open and facilitate learning in the way that you're talking about. And so I was just interested in getting your take on like where you see a need, or like the types of tools that you think could stay out of people's way when it shouldn't be getting in the way, but could facilitate that sort of learning process in the same way that maybe Google search facilitates the searching process. Is there an educational equivalent, or do you feel there's a need in a particular area that could be beneficial?
Yeah, well, I gave you the example of the University of Michigan professor who had students compile their own corpora, right? So, which I think is extremely important. Part of what I'm talking about is helping learners with what they want to learn, right? Not imposing on them, but rather helping to bring out in them what they can learn to meet their own goals. So if you can use computational methods to tease out those patterns in the flux that they need to accomplish their goals, I think that's terrific. The caveat would be, language is context-bound, so if you remove it from the context, can you still help learners to learn to recontextualize the language when they need to, and be mindful that language is always changing. But that's the beauty of computers, you can update your corpus, right? Frequency is not always the only thing that's important in a corpus. And so we have to be careful of that too. We learned that a long time ago before we had computers, where we saw things like, a fork, eating utensil. Fork, not very important, really. It's not very frequently. The word fork is not frequent in anybody's corpus that I know of. But boy, if you're in a restaurant and you need one, it's a pretty important word, isn't it? You could say spoon with those things or something, or go like this, but then you might get a spoon. I don't know. So what am I saying? I'm saying that it can't only be about frequently occurring patterns. It also has to be about meaning, right? And what's important or valuable. But learners can tell you that. Does that help answer? Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Just a quick question about TESOL programs in general, and the idea of asking the question, you as a new teacher within TESOL programs, are you going to individualize and also empower these new teachers when it comes to identifying what type of learners they are going to get? Or just independently of the types of learners, you can get some courses that would kind of fit and, all sizes. In particular, TESOL teachers who go to Asia, do they need to learn some Asian languages? TESOL teachers who go to the Middle East, do they have to learn some also linguistic background of such learners? TESOL teachers who go to southern the United States or so to what extent also teachers maybe should be empowered by simply having some knowledge of learners' background.
Right. Thank you for the question. Am I back on? I wrote it, it's going to sound like such an old fogey, but in 1983, I published an article called Training Teachers or Educating a Teacher. Because in those days, everybody was talking about teacher training, and I said, no, it's got to be teacher educating. And the reason it has to be teacher education is because we can't possibly train learners or teacher learners for all occasions, for all parts of the world, for all levels, for all ages of students. We can't possibly do that. So we have to educate them, not train them. And the way to do that, I think, but by the way, there's a whole other dimension to this, which is teacher agency. And that's really important, because teachers often feel done unto as well, right? But with standards and standards exam, and they're being judged by whether their students do well on these exams. I mean, there's just lots of things about teacher agency that I'm also I find important. And collective agency, when the policy came down to separate children from families, there was a collective outcry across the board. And what happened? The order was rescinded. Now, has it been implemented in its new version? Maybe not. But I do take heart there that, with collective agency, we can accomplish something, and I think teachers can fall into that. Getting back to how do you educate a teacher as opposed to training teachers. I only know of really two parts to that I learned at the School for International Training. One is to help teachers develop some awareness of what's going on, to be able to reflect on what they're doing, but also, well, actually maybe three awareness. Their attitudes, but the one that I've added, I cut it out of this talk, but it's important. Teach teachers and students how to adapt, because that's what we do. When we talk to somebody, when we engage in conversation, we're adapting our language resources all the time for the occasion, for the interlocutor, for the time of day, for our relationship with that interlocutor. We're adapting. We do it quite naturally in a language with which we're comfortable, or a classroom as a teacher with which we're comfortable. But I think adaptation in the biological sense, if you have too big a jump, evolution doesn't go. But if you just change it a little bit, people adapt to the situation. So what are some strategies for adapting? Now, I'm not talking about using things like role play, for example, because a role play, that involves adapting, but that involves adapting. I'm talking about teaching how to adapt. So this is going on, right, and the headmaster walks in, what do? Right? That kind of thing, almost like a business case study approach, maybe. Does that answer your question? So you can't prepare teachers for everywhere. Obviously, the more knowledge you have of the context is great, but don't lose sight of the fact that within every context, there's going to be variation. There are extroverted everybody's, right? We stereotype certain ethnic groups, but they're not all that way. So you always have to be expecting the unexpected. Thank you very much for your attention. That's how